Their Fated Travels, Chapter 1, The Two-Headed Goose. Murder was in the air. The year was 2522 IC, Imperial Calendar. It had been a beautiful day. The setting sun was disappearing over the oddly mismatched rooftops of the houses around the docks district of Altdorf, capital city of the Empire. A place where three great inland rivers met, home to the palace residence of Emperor Karl Franz himself, home to the great church of Sigmar that sat just across the street from the palace, residence of the colleges of magic, the city of countless varied guilds, and home to thousands of ideas of human ingenuity, be it for the good or ill of mankind. Such was the way with the greatest of ideas and best of intentions. This was the city that shone the brightest, like a glowing supernova in the galaxy of mankind, but that which did burn brightest did also cast the longest shadows. An inn sign gently swung, creaking on its rusting chains from the dock's breeze. The image upon it, a two-headed goose, depicting the name of the establishment, was a strange sight to see in a city that took any sort of mutation seriously. The rain began to fall, heavy and sudden, dripping off of the sign, immediately tapping the ground below like a well-rehearsed drum beat from years of practice. The steps below it attested to that, with a worn water stain in them. Just below the sign, the door burst open. A Marienburg man whose richly woven and colourful clothing looked a little ill-fitting on his skinny frame came out of the inn with a wench on each arm. Their width, 3 wide at the already narrow doorway, blocked entry to a genteel-looking woman attempting to step up to the door. The man looked drunken and red-faced and examined the woman before him. He hadn't seen many like her around these parts. She was dressed in white, all over, except for some red trim here and there, and she remained hooded long before the rain even fell. She wore glasses. Beyond all of that, though, from what he could see, he reckoned her to be quite attractive, but not quite his type anyway. The ladies with him were both dark-skinned, a clear indication that they hailed from a foreign land far, far from the Empire. One looked much older than the other. Perhaps it was her mother, thought the woman in white, and then shook off any further thought on the matter. She was nervous, just having to be present in this quarter of the city, and now she was being delayed access to the inn, a place she would never willingly enter of her own volition. The man stood swaying on his feet, wondering what to do next, and the woman in white tried to step to the left, bringing her white metallic staff close to her to allow the three to proceed down the steps. They too had shifted left, though. Then the woman stepped to the right, as did the group. This was getting them nowhere, she thought. "Please," she started. "I have been called on an urgent errand. I need to enter." The man looked at her quizzically, rubbing his stubbly chin, and swayed a little again. The woman touched her staff to the man's forehead and concentrated. He was too inebriated to care. She closed her eyes and seemed to expend a great deal of power in a short amount of time, channeling it through her staff and into the man. He smiled at the tingling sensation through his body, which began to glow a little. Suddenly his face changed to one of cognitive realization once more. Somehow the strange robed woman had brought him to his senses, sobering him. The man looked at her in surprise, as if seeing her for the first time in his life. Then at the women in his arms. He especially regarded the older one with some surprise, turned them all around, and stepped back in through the inn with them. He had decided he would need more drink first. Just before the door closed behind them, Rysandria caught a glimpse of the smoky interior and mixed classes of patrons inside, none of which looked savoury enough for the likes of her to mix with. She had a duty to enter, though. As an initiate of the Shallian Order, she had been commanded to visit the inn on business deemed too low for the priestesses to attend to. She knew that her presence here meant that greater good was being done elsewhere. A worthwhile sacrifice, she thought. She realized that her staff had pushed into the door at the bottom, stopping it from closing. She had unconsciously stopped it from doing so, perhaps fearing that if it closed this time, she would not bring herself to open it. Already she was blushing, unused to such surroundings as these, and the embarrassment of interaction with drunken locals already. Rysandria Elkina Vor took a deep breath in, preparing herself to go inside. Once she'd opened the door, she considered not breathing out at all. Quickly she made her way to the barkeep, trying to ignore the eyes and mouthed comments of nearly every occupant present. A little later that evening, the bar area of the inn had filled up considerably. The rain had driven more customers inside to ready themselves with a drink or 5, before braving the storm in a walk home. Some patrons were here to enjoy the company of human interaction, to unwind and find a bed for the night. The table nearest the bar saw an inebriated man playing a card game with a ruddy-cheeked halfling, dirt smeared upon his face. The human man's build was large, and his sword and garb suggested a knight in training, perhaps a squire, wearing the colours of the White Wolf of Ulrich. A shady figure was sitting in a corner, keeping an eye on everything that happened in the bar area. He sat and watched the door open as someone in particular left, but still he did not move from his secretive spot. He had somehow extinguished the candle above him, and as such he didn't have to make much effort to remain concealed in the shadows that now surrounded his table. 2 glasses of red wine sat in front of him. The one nearest him was still full. The furthest glass, positioned in a place as if someone had been sitting opposite him, had been drunk down to its dregs. Within moments the inn door opened once more. This time it remained open, but no one came in. Some of the customers nearby moved their heads over to see who it might be in the doorway behaving in such an unexpected manner. There stood 2 men. One was a muscular-bearded, broadly built Kislevite, 6'5" tall, and the hat of a Kossar that looked as if it had never been washed upon his head. He carried with him a Kislevite hunting bow, a scimitar, and a shield. He was lightly armoured, but looked hardy enough to not need any armour at all. His features were chiselled and grim like that of a heavy mountainside on a stormy day. It just so happened that the weather around him added to that effect right now. The other man with him was very different indeed. He was of average height, wore the fine garb of a noble house, and carried an air of authority naturally about him. He wore a pair of bizarre-looking spectacles, bizarre in that their ear supports were super-reinforced with a rubber-like material for stability. The right-hand lens socket was built up off of the frame with a screw-shape inlaid pattern going around the metal on the inside. He carried a simple-looking wooden quarterstaff with him, a backpack, and a sack he carried over his shoulder. He too had somewhat of a beard and a moustache, but it was much wilder and uncontrolled in its grooming than that of the larger man's. He was greying in places, but was only 28 years old. Both men stood there in the doorway, with the sign rain droplets plopping down onto the smaller man's forehead, making the watery beat take on a new tone. He seemed blissfully unaware, with a big smile upon his face, as he looked up at the sign above his head and started, "Gosh, I say, Tordrad, look at that sign of this establishment, too. It reminds me of something I saw in my youth." Still, rainwater splashed off of the man's face and ran to the ground below, as the larger of the 2 men rolled his eyes and looked up and away as if in protest at how silly the smaller man was. "Well, that decides it, then. One last night in the city shall be spent here," said the smaller man, and immediately began marching into the inn, swinging his arms in a pronounced manner with every step. The larger man, Tordrad, was now very slowly walking in, but his concentration was on looking up at the sign. "Come on, my good man," came the smaller man again, not even looking around before adding out loud to no one in particular. "Perhaps the barkeep will have some darts. I could use the practice."